not a EU citizen.
This is right, yeah.
So it's this case of, if you're a foreigner in the EU, it affects you. If you're a foreigner outside the EU, they couldn't care less. But if you're German and based in Australia, it still affects you.
But it affects you if you're storing data for your business.
Yeah. So, as I said, from an EU perspective, it's a global thing as long as you're an EU citizen. But yeah, to come to your question, absolutely. I mean, but the fundamental thing is how you control the conversation log as opposed to the actual transactions. And the same goes with when you're pushing through, say, Facebook. Facebook will log a conversation. So if you don't want them to see that, that's where you look at things like either moving to an interactive, which bypasses that conversation flow, or basically redacting the actual response that goes to Facebook. So the bot has the original data, but how you respond and how you send the text bubble back can be redacted, and that's what Facebook sees. Okay, so let's start with some terminology. So the 5 also basic ones, the top 3 are really what we're looking at when we're talking about an NLP, or natural language understanding, natural language processing. So we'll start with intent. So intent, for want of a better term, is what's your goal? What are you actually trying to achieve here? So if we look at an intent, as I said, what that ultimately ties to is some form of action that you're going to process. Now that could be answering a question in an FAQ, it could be kicking off a workflow, you name it. But ultimately think of it as the goal. Now, if we were to look at, say, a simple banking transaction or a banking bot, we could have 3 simple intents here. What's my current balance? I want to transfer some money, or I want an audit trail of what I've spent over the last X time period. So at a high level, they're logical goals. So if I looked at how much money do I have in my checking account, which of those 3 intents is it? So if you had to take that particular question and apply it to a goal, which one would you actually apply it to? It'd be check balance. Likewise, what's my current bank balance? That's a fairly obvious one. That's going to be check balance as well. How much do I spend in the Apple Store is obviously, in this case, track spending. It's not rocket science. It's basically just trying to work out what's the goal of a given statement. So here, for example, pay the babysitter. Obviously, that's transferring funds. So what you then have is, once we look at that, if we look at the actual question, that's referred to as an utterance. And the thing with the way we train the bot is by giving it example utterances. Now, one of the things you'll see when we get to the NLP, one of the things that makes us different is how we handle the actual intent and ultimately the entity, which we'll talk about in a second. But an utterance really is a sample of how someone would ask the question. And when you build it, you have to have a good example, a good corpus of questions that relate to a given goal. So if I start with a given intent, what we do here is we then map that to a set of utterances. So think of it as, from an NLP perspective, we start with, if I ask a question, we can then backport to try and find out what the intent is. Now, this is different to other NLP approaches, which we'll talk about in a sec. Likewise, so what effectively you're doing is you're taking a corpus of example questions and saying anything like this really means this intent. So what you're doing is you're building up a series of intents and examples that would imply that intent. Etc. But the important thing is entities. And entities are the important words that you're trying to track. They're the concepts that you're trying to get to. Account number, things like that. So ultimately, if I'm doing what's my balance, the first thing we need to find out is for which account are you talking about. So account type is an entity that you need to look for. So how much money do I have in my checking account? Obviously, that's a balance inquiry. So that's a balancer's intent. And then the checking account is the important thing we're capturing. Savings, same thing. Now, why is this different? So in many cases, NLP engines start with a bucket of these entities. In other words, let's start with basically a bucket of important terms. Now let's take an example of the word pool. If I start with just a word, I then have to look at a lot more association with other words to try and infer what you're talking about. So if I say, where's the pool? I could be talking about something you swim in, I could be talking about the billiards game, I could be talking about a sweepstake. So starting with the word, starting with an entity, is a much harder way to start. And this is why things like Watson is much harder to train, because you start with this bucket of possible meaningful words. The idea being that if I have lots of word association, I ultimately can work out an intent. We actually start the other way, which is if I have a series of utterances, in other words, examples of how people ask the question, I don't, at this point, even need to know what you're physically asking. I just need to know that enough people asked it this way. So if I had someone come along and in their finest Yoda went, balance I must find. Or even if they put it in Elvish or Klingon or whatever, we actually don't care, because what we're looking for is the fact that statistically people ask a question a given way. And because we've tied those utterances to an intent, we now work out what your goal is based on how you ask the question, not the specifics of the question. Now, what this means is ultimately we're doing a two-pass NLP model. We start with trying to work out what you're asking, and then because entities can be tied to an intent. So rather than starting with an entity, the important bits of information, and inferring what you're asking, we start by working out what you're asking, intent determination, and then because once I know you're talking swimming, I instantly have domain set this thing. I know you're talking, when I use the word pool, you're talking about a swimming pool, because your intent was about sports. So what you're looking at is a way of throwing away all the irrelevant meanings of the words. So rather than starting with the word and then trying to work out what you're talking about by grouping different words together, we start with what are you talking about, and that automatically shrinks down the possible meaning of the words. So ultimately that gives you a much more successful determination, confidence level of what's your ultimate goal, because you've started with what are they talking about? Okay, we've got these questions, that gives us an intent. Once I've got the intent, I know the meaningful words that go within it, I can work out the entities. So basically what that means is once I know this, I know which words to look for in the utterance, rather than starting with words and then trying to work back. That make sense? Okay, these are more examples of the same. Now there are standard entities built into the system. These are things like dates, durations, telephone structures, address structures, things like that. Currencies. So if someone puts, I want to transfer £100, then it's going to take the word pound and work out that you're talking about a currency. If I say, how much did I spend in December, it works out that December is obviously a date range, and then we'll apply that date range. So these built-in entities basically allow you to separate out the meanings out of the thing. So in this case, how many entities do we have in this statement? Now we know we've got savings account.
Yeah, tomorrow.
Tomorrow is an inferred date. And the third one is currency, dollar. So in fact, we've actually got 3 entities: a custom entity, the account type, and 2 system entities, duration or date, and the currency. Now from an NLP perspective, as I said, what you're looking at is the accuracy or the confidence that you think you've got the right answer. Now, none of the engines will give you 100% confidence. And in fact, if they did, I wouldn't trust it. A good confidence level of accuracy is about 80 to 85%. And it's statistical anyway. So the more data you have, the better you'll get. But the nice thing with the engine that we have is you can actually start with a very low number of utterances to start building. So literally you can start the NLP engine with like 10 to 15 examples of how someone would ask that question. Now the advantage of doing that is it allows you to work out, have I got the right intent and have I got the right entities? In other words, am I actually capturing the right information in the first place? Rather than having to build a huge database of possible sort of outcomes and then try and work backwards. So you start with a small number, work out have I got the right structures. If I do, and then I train it to come back to your question before, that's where I train it with questions I didn't know about. So we actually have 2 training models. Now, unlike one of the questions we get asked is, will you tell me the algorithm that you use? And the answer is no, we don't. Nor do we allow you to plug in new algorithms. What we have is 2 models where, because there's hundreds of algorithms that go into it, but basically the training in your development mode, you'll stick to this one, the HT, or what's internally referred to as Sakura, but it's HT in the UI. This is effectively a rule-based model. It's a semantic model that looks at the language set. So it doesn't really handle misspellings or anything like that. It's really a testing model to see, do I have the right information? It's very fast. So basically you can train it in seconds. But whereas TM or Tamal this is a full-blown neural net based system. So this is the 2-pass system I was telling you about. So where it does first pass based on the neural net to find out the intent, and then we use a semantic model or rule-based linguistics model to basically look at the utterance. Now, to come to the point before the fact that we were only in English, it was the second phase of that, the NLP, that basically does the linguistics. So that was why we did English originally. Now, how do we find out about English? And this comes back, this is the one part of the product that's unsupervised learning. So we don't want to do unsupervised learning on our domain. We don't care about unsupervised learning on understanding the language. So the way we do that is we actually behind the scenes go off and look at multiple websites and look at how people use language and then refer back. So if I came to the banking example, what's my balance? Then obviously it's going to understand that. But if I said, am I skint? Then it actually works out that skint means I don't have money, therefore it's a balance inquiry. Likewise, am I broke? These are because people use that semantically out there in other systems. So the full-blown NLP is learning the language by going and looking at how people use the language. So that's a difference between supervised learning of the domain and unsupervised learning of the language. As I said, you don't want to do unsupervised learning of your domain. It's just very dangerous.
Question.
Yep.
So if you were putting the product out globally, you're going to have to start thinking about local colloquialisms, local changes to the language. So you talk about skint.
Yeah.
It's a very pommy term.
Yeah.
May not mean something in Australia, it means something completely New Zealand.
Oh yeah. So the way.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
So the thread of the question is that are we holding different libraries of dependent on region? Because
Not
it's
really,
English
because
is
what
quite-
we do is if you're looking at obviously we run into a lot in the case of things like English, where you have